Hey, what's up guys? Today I'll show you a horror thriller film, KANSAN. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The film begins at a rundown hospital experiencing a crisis, as there are too many patients getting admitted. But they are understaffed, running out of supplies, and staff is still unpaid. There's an ambulance contacting the hospital, but doctors, Yuzumi and Arkiba, ignore it because of the current crisis. The head nurse informs Arkiba about the shortage of supplies and the number of nurses that have quit within the past 2 weeks. The remaining nurses are working non-stop, and they put patients in shared rooms, risking cross-infection. They need to act immediately, so she proposes forcing some patients home, even though it's unethical. There are also lots of neglected patients, including a burnt man covered with bandages, an old man who is constantly in pain, and a victim of a hit-and-run accident. One of the remaining nurses is inexperienced, so she keeps picking the burnt patient with syringes. Her co-worker, the mean nurse, stops her before she can do more damage to the burnt patient's body. She tells rookie nurse to practice on herself first if needed, so she will not make the same mistake on another patient. Rookie nurse comes out of the room in frustration, but the old woman in the hallway catches her attention. The old woman faces the mirror and talks like she's conversing with someone. Head nurse appears and instructs her to take the patient to neurology to another doctor. Meanwhile, another doctor stops his co-worker from suturing a patient's wounds. He reminds him that he is a failed pediatrician who begged the hospital to take him, and he will never be a surgeon. Later that day, the ambulance calls the hospital, and Arkiba answers it. The medic informs him about the emergency patient who needs a well-equipped hospital, as he might be infectious. However, Arkiba refuses to take him, as the hospital's current situation is not going very well. On the other hand, a neurological doctor explains the old woman's condition to the rookie nurse. The old woman's state is not unusual, as the shrinking of the brain happens to elderly people. In her case, she sees her dead-long family in the mirrors, which is the product of her mental process. Before leaving the hospital, the doctor reminds the head nurse not to let the old woman have a mirror because it might upset her if it breaks. Meanwhile, Yuzumi expresses his concern about the crisis they're experiencing with Arkiba. They keep buying new equipment, but not hiring technicians, so the expense and renovations simultaneously increase. Arkiba does not reply and shares that he has not heard from the director since yesterday, which adds to their concern. The director might have abandoned them, but they cannot do the same to their patients. Yuzumi suggests looking for hospitals that will take their patients and do the transfer to avoid the responsibilities ethically. Their discussion gets interrupted when the ambulance arrives at the hospital. Arkiba faces them and refuses to take the patients since they are understaffed. However, the medic threatens to report the hospital if the patient dies on the way to another hospital for treatment. At that same time, the head nurse catches the rookie nurse practicing injecting syringes to herself. This angers her as the rookie nurse wastes the syringes on herself, and they are experiencing a shortage of supplies. The tension gets interrupted when another nurse, nicknamed Nurse Misuse, rushes to the room and informs them that something has happened in room 3. The head nurse and Nurse Misuse immediately go to room 3 and carry the burnt patient who has fallen off the bed. Nurse Misuse leaves to get Arkiba and Yuzumi, leaving the head nurse pumping oxygen to the patient while the old woman watches her. On the other hand, Arkiba has no choice but to take the patient only for emergency treatment. They prepare to move the patient to the emergency room when Nurse Misuse comes running and informs him about what happened. The two hurriedly run to room 3, Arkiba leaving the patient he refused to admit. The three of them lift up the burnt patient back to the bed, but his pulse and blood pressure are down. Yuzumi and the mean nurse come in with the defibrillator, and Arkiba repeatedly uses it, but the burnt patient's body is not responding. They go to the alternatives, which are steroids and calcium chlorate. Nurse Misuse quickly gets and injects them into the two, followed by another defibrillator pumped by Arkiba. The burnt patient's pulse returns, but then Arkiba notices the strange color on his tube. Nurse Misuse explains that she injected calcium chlorate, which alarms them as it is lethal when injected with a high dosage. Also, it was supposed to be calcium chloride. The patient's vitals begin to drop again, so they attempt to revive him once again, but they fail miserably, as his body cannot take the effects of the drugs. Nurse Misuse begins to panic, as she may have accidentally killed the patient. She insists that Arkiba said chlorate, not chloride, and the mean nurse luckily heard it too, so the blame is not on her. Although he does not recall what he ordered, Arkiba takes full responsibility for the patient's death. Yuzumi immediately counters Arkiba's decision, reasoning that they would haven't been able to save him anyway. This does not agree with the head nurse, as what Yuzumi proposes is falsifying the medical report. The tension arises, as the head nurse and Yuzumi argue about what to put on the report. Arkiba attempts to stop them by taking full responsibility, but neither wants to listen. Nurse Misuse breaks down into tears as she blames herself for not thinking first before injecting the drug. Everyone's problem gets stopped when the mean nurse points out that the burnt patient never had any visitors. Since the burnt patient never had any visitors, not even his friends and family called the hospital, they could hide his death. so the health department will be the one who will take him, meaning there might be an official autopsy. They cannot hold him for 2 days to complete the cell breakdown, so the only way is to heat him up. Since the patient's skin is burned, heating him up will speed up the decaying process, and so dissolving the chemical in his body. They agree with the plan and put the burnt patient in room 1 as room 5 is occupied by another doctor. They surround him with UV LED lights and torches to fasten up the decaying process, and Archibald will watch him first not to let him decay too far. Meanwhile, the mean nurse confronts the rookie nurse about what happened in room 3. The rookie nurse has accidentally dropped her ponytail outside the room, and the mean nurse saw it as they transferred the burnt patient to room 1. The mean nurse realizes that the burnt patient did not fall off the bed, but he tried to run away from the rookie nurse, who incorrectly injected his arm. On the other hand, the head nurse discovers that the patient Archibald refused to admit had been left in the hallway through the CCTV. She immediately informs him about it, and they hurriedly come to the ER. However, the patient was taken by Dr. Scapegoat, who had fallen asleep a while ago in room 4. Dr. Scapegoat lets them see the patient's state, and they are both astonished to see his body mass liquefying into green goo. Archibald wants to report the unusual case to the health department, but Dr. Scapegoat insists on examining the patient. Dr. Scapegoat summons Yuzumi and lets him see the patient before explaining his plan. They will study the patient and look for the specific causative agent that caused the peculiar case, and once they do, offers and research grants will pour in. Apparently, it's their good chance to be known in the medical field. Yuzumi disagrees with the plan, but Archibald tells him they had no choice because Dr. Scapegoat was in room 4. They do not know how much Dr. Scapegoat knows about the events in room 3, so they reluctantly agree to help with the examination. Dr. Scapegoat assigns the head nurse to monitor the patient, while Archibald and Yuzumi check the remaining patients in the hospital. Archibald appoints Nurse Misuse to check room 1 every now and then, and while they're busy, the head nurse gets more anxious as time passes. She can hear very clearly as the patient's liquefied body mass drops on the cold floor. Not long after that, the 3 doctors return to the room, find her unconscious, and discover that the patient has escaped. They put the head nurse in a room first, before splitting up to search for the escaped patient. They look into rooms, ventilation, and other possible spaces he could have crawled up, but they cannot find him. So they return to the room where they put the head nurse and discuss how medically impossible the escaped patient's case is. As they do so, the head nurse wakes up and excuses herself to return to work, like nothing happened. She goes to the nurse ward, where Nurse Misuse repeatedly attempts to stop her as she picks up the used syringes from the trash bin. However, the head nurse keeps picking them up before putting them into the sterilizer machine. Nurse Misuse screams so loud that Archibald and Yuzumi hear her. They immediately check it, only to find the head nurse has put the used syringes into the sterilizer along with her hands. The head nurse gasps like an asthmatic person as she removes her hands from the sterilizer before she begins to bleed green goo. They realize that they are at risk of infection, so they immediately cover with plastic to limit the infection. After that, they transfer her into room 5 and quickly leave her there. The head nurse begins to hallucinate as she keeps saying sorry to someone. Her internal organs begin to liquefy too, and with her last strength, she pierces the plastic with her right hand. The trio returns to room 5 and discovers that her internal organs are gone. Nurse Misuse begins to panic, but she restrains herself from doing so when Dr. Scapegoat arrives. They inform him about what happened, prompting him to search for the pathogen host to stop the spread of the infection. As she monitors the burnt patient, Nurse Misuse repeatedly stops herself from puking. At that same time, the mean nurse finds the rookie nurse drawing blood on herself. The rookie nurse begins to act strangely and repeatedly jabs herself with a huge syringe. As she does so, she tearfully shares that even though she's a slow learner, her passion for being a nurse and helping people are genuine. Her words prompt the mean nurse to feel guilty for belittling her skills as a nurse. The scene gets awry as the rookie nurse lets out maniacal laughs and plunges herself with 2 syringes, splattering the mean nurse with green goo. Archibald and Yuzumi soon discover her death, which raises their tension and worry. Archibald believes it is an airborne infection, but Dr. Scapegoat insists on finding the host before doing anything. As they discuss the case, the mean nurse immediately removes her uniform, as she realizes that she might have been infected from getting splattered with green goo. The doctors agree to solve the case within an hour, and if they fail to do so, they will report it to the officials. Yuzumi leaves the 2 to start the investigation and put an end to the heavy events. Meanwhile, the mean nurse encounters an apparition of what is supposed to be the burnt patient's mother, who mysteriously showed up for her son. At that same time, Yuzumi is filled with emotional guilt after encountering the ghost of the patient that he killed. The nurses were worn out from nursing him, so if Yuzumi didn't do anything to revive him when his heart stopped beating. As Yuzumi apologizes for his wrongdoings, Archibald walks in and finds him alone. Although confused, Archibald attempts to snap him out of his delusion, but Yuzumi's eyes suddenly turn white and green goo begins to come out from him. After witnessing it, Archibald panics, so he immediately leaves his friend and looks for Dr. Scapegoat. However, he encounters the mean nurse, now infected, hanging from the ceiling, smiling creepily as green goo covers her body. Archibald hurriedly runs away from her and goes to room 1 to save Nurse Misuse. However, he discovers that she is giving her own blood to the dead burnt patient. But not just that, another host from the patient's body has green liquid, which is being transferred to the infected head nurse. Archibald quickly flees the room to leave the infected facility. He stumbles upon Dr. Scapegoat on his way, who is still calm after being informed about all the incidents. This prompts Archibald to suspect him of creating and spreading the virus. Dr. Scapegoat calmly denies his accusation and explains how the virus spreads. It is not an airborne infection, but a mentally spread disease that infects the victim's subconscious. Dr. Scapegoat confesses that he was wide awake in room 4, while they were panicking in room 3 about the death of the burnt patient. He knows that the patient's death was inevitable, but the fact that the doctors and nurses tried to cover it up was ethically and morally wrong. As Archibald insists on blaming Dr. Scapegoat for the recent deaths, the neurological doctor shows up and reluctantly informs him that no one is in front of him. This prompts him to realize that there is no Dr. Scapegoat at all, and he has been speaking with himself through the mirrors. However, he still believes that there is an airborne infection that makes people crazy before killing themselves. But then the two find the corpses of the mean and rookie nurse covered with blood and not a single green goo in sight. The neurological doctor immediately calls the police and reports the murder in the hospital, while Archibald puts the burnt patient back in his bed. As he does so, he finds the tag on the patient's bed, which has Dr. Scapegoat's real name written on it. This prompts Archibald to recall that Dr. Scapegoat was never a doctor. He was actually the burnt patient. It turns out the guilt of killing the burnt patient by misdosage was too intense that it caused Archibald to hallucinate. There was never an infection. The guilt overpowered his sanity that he made himself believe there was an infection and Dr. Scapegoat. Overwhelmed by his guilt, he blamed his delusions for killing his coworkers. The hospital gets evacuated the following day, not because of the infection, but because a deranged killer, Archibald, has mysteriously disappeared and is on the prowl. The news also reveals that the paramedic never left the infected patient because he noticed that Archibald was acting strange, especially for a doctor. While the remaining patients are getting evacuated for transfer, the neurological doctor sees the ambulance lights green instead of red as she walks to the exit. She begins to panic as she remembers that she had neglected a patient. As she realizes that her guilt begins to overpower her, she accidentally cuts herself with a scalpel, prompting green blood to come out. The neurological doctor lets out a terrified scream as she realizes that she has been infected. The film ends with Archibald's hand falling to the cold ground as his body is trapped and dissolved in a locker. Green goo covers the locker, inflicting that Archibald is the last victim of his conscience and subconsciousness. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.